Dambisa Moyo is here. She is the author of Winner Take All, China's Race for Resources and What It Means for the Rest of the World. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
It's such a timely book, and hopefully, we'll wake some people up. It sounds like we need some waking up. What the idea is that, we're constantly fighting over ever-dwindling resources, whether they be land, water, fossil fuel. And you're saying the only country, the one country that's looking around and saying, I need to prepare for this, is China.
Yes, I should qualify that by saying that China has adopted a very systematic and deliberate approach to securing resources. But not only has she done that, she's done it in a very friendly way, in a symbiotic way. So she's doing these deals from Chile, Brazil, here in Canada, across Africa, Russia, really across the world. And the relationship between the host countries, the resource-rich countries, and China is very symbiotic and very friendly. It's a very, very clear departure from sort of the approaches of resource acquisition that you've seen perhaps from the United States, which has tended to be much more military-based and much more aggressive.
Now, I know when you're not in the West, you're very aware of the West, but it's not the same the other way around. Do you think we know enough about what's happening in China, and is that, if we don't, is that going to be to our detriment?
Yes, I don't think we know enough, and I'm not claiming to know every single aspect of it, but I do fear that the messaging around China, what China is doing, tends to be incredibly negative. It's always about, the headlines tend to be about human rights violations, manipulation of the exchange rate, concerns about the lack of democracy. But there's so much that they've done that's been phenomenal. And if you come from the emerging markets, you look to China and you think, gosh, they've managed to move 300 million people out of poverty in 30 years, something that no other country has done in the history of the world. And instead of us learning from them and also trying to help them to achieve these sort of real improvements in their political environment, I think they are subject to a lot of negative messaging and criticism.
Whether you talk about Africa or Chile, as you use that as an example, what's the attraction there for those countries to do business with China?
Yeah. So a lot of these regions, particularly the emerging markets, well, first of all, 90% of the world's population lives in the emerging markets. And in these economies, up to 70% of the population is under the age of 24. So really, really young population. We need investment, need job creation, we need to trade. And unfortunately, because of subsidy programs such as the farm subsidy program in the United States or the Common Agriculture Policy in Europe, these markets have tended to be closed off. They've been blocked off from the emerging world. And China, which has a 1.3 billion population, has 7% arable land, desperate for engagement and desperate to import crops and food and minerals. And so it really is a win-win in that cliched.
So are they actually just buying? They're buying rights in countries.
Well, the political systems vary quite dramatically. So, for example, land, in terms of land across much of Africa, you cannot buy land outright. You get a leasehold, not a freehold. And a lot of the deals that are being made are swaps. So China will invest a certain amount of money, and in return, the country will offer or will pay in oil or in beef, as it is in Brazil, to China over a certain period of time. So it is very dynamic and very different.
And the Chinese would rather the Africans, when a survey was taken, would much rather deal with the Chinese than the Americans.
Yes, this is, I think, again, something very surprising. If you think about the role of China in Africa, it tends to, again, be painted in a very negative light. People think it's about neocolonialism, abuse of rights, use of prisoners. We've not been able to find that data in a very systematic sense. There was a survey that was conducted across African countries about 3 or 4 years ago by the Pew Institute in the United States, and they found that consistently by wide margin, 95%, 98%, Africans said, we love the Chinese, they're doing a good job and fundamentally improving our lives, and we actually prefer them to Americans. And this is not to say that the Chinese should come into Africa carte blanche, but I think that they actually are doing good things, and they need to be managed, and those relationships are going to be difficult and challenging.
But from a Canadian standpoint, we can't just, maybe we can, depending on who you're talking to, overlook the human rights abuses. Yeah. Should one negate the other?
Well, I don't think so. No is the answer. But I think that if you travel to the emerging markets, whether it's India, across South America, Africa, people find that there's a lot of hypocrisy on this issue. China is the largest lender to the United States government. China is a huge investor, not just in Canada, but across Europe. And for some reason, the issue of human rights doesn't really, is not a big bone of contention when you're taking Chinese money in those circumstances. But immediately China is interested in investing in Africa or Russia or across South America, it becomes a bone of contention. situation, and I think ultimately to the detriment of the relationship.
I'll keep it a little bit local. What would you advise Canada to do in terms of its relations with China?
So I think that the relationship should be fostered. I think it's going to happen. I mean, after Keystone, there's been a lot of discussion about China's role as a partner for Canada. I do think that these relationships always need to be managed. It's not just because it's China. I think it's in general, when you have foreign investors, you should manage those relationships very aggressively. I do think there's a huge opportunity for Canada, for the economy, the Canadian economy, and I think overall, it's just the benefits will be had by both if it's managed properly.
Do you think this is a question of, it's just the sheer scale of the Chinese population and the size of that market and the control one may give over and not realize you're giving over control along the road?
Well, I think that's where management comes into play. I think if you have great policy making domestically, and the governments are actually using the Chinese money effectively at home, so instead of using it for consumption, maybe use it for investment, building schools, infrastructure, and so on, I can see that there'll be benefit. I do not believe that the Chinese are interested in any political agenda as they go around the world. I think they are fundamentally interested in satisfying, satiating a huge demand for their own population.
You really believe there's no political? I mean, that seems
absolutely not. They're incredible.
But I mean, any country dealing with any other country always has some kind of political
Well, let me put it this way. I think in terms, this notion that China is somehow trying to take over the world and become a global power, I think is really far-fetched. As I said, they've got a 1.3 billion population, 300 million people live like us in sort of Western living standards, a billion population that is desperately poor. And there just seems to me to be the political imperative for the Chinese leadership to make sure that they stay in power. They've got to make sure that they are satisfying the needs of the people at home. They have absolutely no interest. In fact, one of the criticisms on the other side is that because China has no interest in political infrastructure, they're able to do deals with dictators and despots.
But there is a pushback in changing parts of their government to accommodate more human rights.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's going to happen organically. I think we have high expectations because we live in developed free nations where we expect these things. And I hope that China moves very swiftly towards a better environment. But I think that they need to be given a bit more credit for for the positive things that they are doing around the world, with the recognition that they have challenges and they need to make significant improvements in democracy and human rights.
Such an interesting book. Dambisa Moyo, thank you so much.
Thank you
Winner
for having
Take
me.
All, China's Race for Resources and What It Means for the Rest of the World. Thanks so much.
Thank you.